Knock, knock. The story takes place nearly 30 years ago, but I can remember as if it was yesterday. At the time, I must have been about 5 years old, and my brother Benji had just turned 4. My parents were saving up to buy a house, so they rented out a basement for the time being. I remember it was fall because it was raining a lot, and the leaves were scattered everywhere in the neighborhood. My grandma and grandpa were also visiting from out of town. Fall was my favorite season, maybe because my name was Autumn, so perhaps there's an automatic bias. It was Thanksgiving long weekend in Canada. My brother, grandpa, and I were seated in the living room. We were watching cartoons while my grandpa must have fallen asleep midway through. My grandma and mom were across from us in the kitchen cooking up dinner. My dad was running his last truck of cargo to a client. He worked locally, which meant he would be home. Often it would be around 12:30 in the morning. My mom would always wait up for him as he would be starving for a meal after working a 15-hour day. My mom used to have a job working at a government-funded recreational center in the administration department, but since my brother and I were born, she became a stay-at-home mom. I was sharing popcorn with my brother from a plastic bowl when my mom had to remind us that if we wanted to see a show seated on the carpet, we should do it further away, otherwise we would ruin our eyes and need glasses. The table was decorated with mini pumpkins, a scented candle, and orange and burgundy colored placemats. The food smelled amazing. There was a commercial break, and I knew I had a couple minutes to use the bathroom before the show came back on. But by the time I returned back to the living room, my mom had the remote turning the TV off, while my brother whined a little. My grandma shook my grandpa awake, which startled him. My mom said a prayer, and then went around the room so we could share what we were thankful for. My brother said his toys and TV, while I said school, food, TV, my dollies and friends, of course. What can I say? I was young but grateful for a lot of things. My mom plated Benji and my food. There was mashed potato and gravy, which was my favorite, even to this day. There was also shredded turkey and corn. We all ate silently until the phone rang. My mom picked up the cordless phone. It was my dad on the other end. He said he would be running a bit late than usual, as there was only one person unloading the skids and there was a lot more to go. He told her he would call the moment everything was done and he reached his workplace to park his truck. My dad didn't have his own cell phone because it was expensive, so he had to use the office one. After dinner, we got a vanilla ice cream cone each. Benji's hand was covered in the drippings of the vanilla ice cream. My grandma then, one by one, gave Benji and I a bath. Benji's bath always took longer because he would want to play with his Hot Wheels and rubber duckies in the tub. I was wearing my brat's sleep dress, cuddling under my pink fleece blanket in my parents' bed. The basement had only 2 bedrooms, so Benji and I had to share with my parents as long as my grandparents were staying with us, which was about 2 more weeks. I was looking at the pictures in the Disney book Aladdin because I was just learning to read when my brother ran into the room and jumped onto the bed. My mom followed soon after to settle him down. Looking back, I guess it was because of all that sugar before bed. While my grandma was tidying up the kitchen and my grandfather was taking his turn in the bathroom, my mom read us a book called I Know an Old Lady Who Swallowed a Pie, which wasn't as morbid as the old lady who swallowed a fly and then died after swallowing a horse. Looking back, I don't know why as kids we would have thought it was super funny. As Benji and I were tucked in, my mother left the room. I believe it was a long while after I had been sleeping when the sounds of someone knocking to what appeared to be the front door woke me up. My parents were not sleeping in the same bed yet, which meant my dad wasn't home, but he would never knock on the door as he had his own set of keys. I could hear my grandfather snoring, but I could also hear the whispers of my mom and grandma coming from the kitchen. They were wondering who could be knocking at such a late hour. The knocks became louder and louder, and I could hear the ladies frantically panic. They didn't want to wake any of us up, but that was too late because my eyes were wide open. "Who is it?" my mom asked a stranger on the other side. "Please," said the desperate voice, "let me in. I'm scared and my boyfriend might hurt me again. There was no peephole in the door, so my grandma asked the young woman to go to the front of the window so they could identify if she really is who she says. I heard the blinds shuffle as they saw the woman and then mutually agreed to let her in. I quietly got up out of bed and creeped down the hall. I peeked into the kitchen to see a white woman with light brown hair wearing a puffy green coat. She was drenched from the pouring rain. She thanked my mom as she pulled out a chair from the table to sit down. My grandma said she would go and get a clean towel for her to dry off. She started to turn the corner to walk down the hall when she spotted me. She wasn't expecting to see anyone there, so she let out a shriek and then asked me what I was doing awake. I know lying isn't what young kids are taught, but I feared what would happen if I told the truth, so I played it off and said I was thirsty and needed a glass of water. My grandma nodded her head, meaning that it was okay, but as she walked towards the linen closet, she told me to be quick. My mom saw me and she obviously heard the conversation between my grandma and I, so she was in the middle of filling up my plastic cup. She handed it to me. "Now straight to bed," she said. I glanced at the young woman again, who looked back at me and gave a partial but friendly smile. I turned around and went back into the room. After a few sips of my water, I put the cup on the dresser and went into the bed. I couldn't make out the entire conversation, but from the faint voices, I did hear key words like love, scared, unhappy, breakup, and lots of sobbing and crying in between. I somehow couldn't keep my eyes open, and so I fell asleep. The next day I woke up with my parents still asleep next to us. I slowly woke Benji up, and we went to brush our teeth. I then took cereal and milk out for the both of us as we quietly watched some cartoons. My mom walked into the living room telling us to lower the volume as it may wake up Grandma and Grandpa. I asked her what happened to the lady from last night. My mom held her finger up to her mouth as she said shh. She told me that she had called a cab and the lady had left before Dad had came home. That he has no idea about the situation, and my mom wasn't planning on telling him as he gets very protective about letting strangers in the house. She told me, with all seriousness, that although the woman was safe, that I should never listen to any stranger that invites us into their car or home or needs help, that they could be pretending and be very dangerous and very bad, that I should run and tell a grown-up immediately. It was in that moment I had to also promise my mom to never bring that night up ever again. In a way, it was our little secret. A few weeks later, my grandparents packed up their suitcases and were ready to go back home. They only lived 6 hours away, but we rarely got to see them, especially the fact that they were getting older, so making frequent trips were really difficult, and my dad was always working. My mom really didn't drive either, so it was tough every time to say goodbye. I would always cry a little. The place then became quiet, real quick. It was mid-December and my last day of kindergarten before the Christmas break. I remember my mom picking me up from school with Benji by her side. We had a snowball fight when we got home for a bit while my mom was making us a hot cup of cocoa with buttered toast. When we were nice and exhausted, we dusted off our boots and went inside. I took off my snowsuit and helped Benji with his. We took our plate to the living room and sat down. I put on the TV. The animated movie Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer was playing. Benji and I were pretty focused in the story. The phone then rang. It was my grandma. Although I was watching the movie, I could still hear bits and pieces of my mom talking because her voice was pretty loud, as we were practically in the same room. She told my grandma she did call her and she saw something which was bad news. I could hear my mom crying. When I got up to go to her, my mom turned around and went into her room, closing the door behind her. I was a kid, so that thought kind of went over my head. Until recently. 30 years later, as a young woman myself, I was lying in my bed with my now husband when my memory from that night popped into my head at such a random time. The following morning, I decided to call her and ask her about the details that happened decades ago. My mom was shocked to hear that I actually remembered something like that from such a young age. She also recalled that event and told me the secrets from that night. She said the woman fled from our home, which was a 20-minute walk from us. It was raining profusely, and she didn't know anyone she could have called. She saw our lights on in our basement, so she thought she could talk to someone and use a phone. She was very scared to enter a stranger's home, as she didn't know what to expect if we were possible criminals, but from her own experience, she felt like nothing could be worser. Her boyfriend, she was with for 3 years, had a very bad temper. He was practically controlling and would fight over little things. Even if nothing was wrong, he would fish for ways to turn it into an argument. He lived to show his power. He would often get into bar brawls or give lip to cashiers at the grocery store. He really wasn't a nice man. She had bruises over her body and cuts on her lips from when he punched her. She was balding in a few areas because he had yanked her hair out. He didn't do drugs and drank responsibly. It was his personality that was disgusting. Alana was a woman in distress's name. She wanted to officially leave him with no traces back to her. She felt she was going to press charges against domestic violence and literally wanted to never see him again. She was later picked up in a police car and taken to the nearest station. "So no cab was called?" I asked, because that was what my mom had told me. "Of course not," she said. "I couldn't tell you the truth because you were too young to understand what was going on. Plus, you'd probably ask 1,000,000 questions which I didn't even have the responses to." That made sense, I thought. I was a very curious young girl. But then, the story wasn't over, my mom continued. She told me that a few months later, she was watching the news, and Alana's picture popped up in the breaking news crime stories section. She had been drugged and strangled to death by a man named Cody and left in the closet of a hotel room. Housekeeping arrived shortly after the checkout time to clean the room and found the body in the closet. At that point, Alana had already been dead for 9 hours. "Is that why you were crying on the phone to Grandma that day when you picked me up from school, right before winter holidays?" I asked. My mom paused briefly over the phone before saying, "Wow, you're on fire today. Your memory is just spot on." "Mom, do you think that man who murdered her was her boyfriend or ex?" "Maybe," my mom said. Alana never mentioned his name to us, but it's probable that she either got back together with him and met her demise, or she actually left him and he saw her somewhere to rekindle what they had and used the opportunity to take revenge and kill her. We'll never know. "Really does sound like an episode of Dateline," I said. "Yep," my mom replied. "Things sometimes get worse before better, but in Alana's situation, it must have been written that way for her to go. You see, my mom believed a lot in God's plan, more than free will and destiny, but that was a discussion I wasn't about to have with her. After I hung up the phone, I sat in a chair thinking. Even though I never met the woman or personally spoke to her, my heart sank when my mom told me the news. It had been many years since her death, yet I could still remember her beautiful yet traumatized face. Now that I had a clear version of the story, perhaps it's closure for my curiosity, but I can't begin to imagine what Alana must have felt minutes before she knew that she was going to die. Tonight, I'm going to count my blessings and hug my husband tight, telling him how much I love him. Hey Scary Story fans, I hope you enjoyed these short stories written and narrated by me. If you have a story that's fiction or non-fiction and would like it featured in the next video, you can send it to the email listed in the description below. In the meantime, sweet dreams!